All right. You're supposed to remind me of anything?
Oh, we were on that slide.
That's what you're supposed to remind me of?
Yeah.
Okay. So, if I remember correctly, we briefly talked about this. I'm only going to briefly talk about it again. You have situations like Google where they have a whole bunch of server class computers, but one of these server class specific machines isn't enough to handle their load, so they have to have cluster systems set up to offload requests to the server that's least busy right now. And the same thing goes with storage area networks. So take that idea of computing power on the CPU side, where you have to split it up amongst a whole bunch of computers, and take it over to hard drives, where we need to have some sort of network of hard drives where if stuff needs to be stored, so if you use any of Google's cloud storage stuff directly, like they have something called a data store. One of the nice things about modern day data stores compared to historical databases, which are called relational databases, out of curiosity, how many of you have had the database class here with Professor Wall? 1.5 people? 2.5 people. Okay, good. One of the things you'll learn in there is this concept of relational databases. Relational databases have a goal. So this is another example of the grand ideas of computer science. Everything kind of intertwines with everything else. Relational databases have the goal of not repeating data, minimizing your footprint for storing an amount of data. So for instance, you might have multiple tables in a relational database where you have 3 pieces of information about a user stored here, 3 pieces of information about a user stored here, and then another table that shares those 2. But those 3 pieces of information are never duplicated. So you minimize the amount of data that actually needs to be duplicated. Typically, you do this on like a user ID basis, where you have a user ID on each of these tables, where those user IDs are the same. So wherever user ID is 15 here, that's this guy's 3 pieces of information. User ID 15 here, that's the same user's 3 pieces of information. And those 2 can be joined into this table down here, which allow you to still connect into user ID 15. So the goal of those systems was to store stuff in some sort of logical way that you can query them. Give me all the users who have a date of birth less than 1984. Something like that. But they wanted to be very efficient when it came to actual hard drive space that the data would take up. Why is that? Why would a system want to be careful about how much hard drive space it takes up? Very related to the Y2K bug. Back in the day when these systems were created, memory was at a premium. Memory, hard drive space, all this stuff was at a premium. When those same days when you had 32 kilobytes of memory, you also only had 512K of hard drive space, or 1 megabyte of hard drive space, something like that. Something that's a far, far, far cry from what we think is normal today, right? So back then, memory was very costly. I think I've used the example before. I don't know if I used it in here, but I'll just quickly give you the punchline. I had a computer when I was in high school that was a 486 DX2 66 megahertz machine, and it shipped with 8 megabytes of RAM and a 420 gigabyte hard drive. Or I'm sorry, 420 megabyte hard drive. Okay, and that was bleeding edge. This was like 1995 or something like that. That was bleeding edge. We had to wait for them to release the 66 megahertz processor. And I remember after the first year, this is when I was really tearing apart computers and learning about what was inside of them and things like that. After the first year, we decided I convinced my dad I wanted to upgrade the RAM to 16 megabytes. Sick. Nobody needs 16 megabytes of RAM. Okay, and I wanted to get up to a 1 gigabyte hard drive. 1 gigabyte. So just going from 8 megabytes to 16 megabytes of RAM, how much do you think that cost? Megabytes. 8 megabytes of RAM. Today you can go and pay retail and get a 4 gigabyte chip for what? If you walk into Best Buy, you can buy a 4 gigabyte chip for your laptop for $70, $80, something like that, right? Maybe it's 100, but whatever. It's not expensive. 8 megabytes cost me $1,000 for 8 megabytes. The hard drive. I did a second hard drive. I set them up as a master-slave system back when you had IDE cables, not serial ATA cables. So IDE cables, which can only support 2 drives at the same time. Serial ATA can actually only support 1, but you just get multiple serial ATA ports. I got a 540 megabyte hard drive, so I'd have a total of about a gigabyte, and I think that was another $1,000. Where you can go and get a 3 terabyte hard drive from Best Buy, again, paying retail, paying a premium as opposed to going online and ordering it from Newegg or something like that, where you probably save 20%. Go to Best Buy, and what's a 3 terabyte hard drive? $150 ish. Again, not $1,000 for something that can barely store anything by today's standards, right? So the cost of hard drive space, the cost of memory was, by today's standards, astronomical. Very, very, very expensive. So the goals of people writing databases, things for storing things over long periods of time in an organized way that we can query from them, retrieve data quickly, one of their goals was to minimize the footprint of the data, because it was expensive not to. Well, today we don't have that problem. How many of you have a Gmail account? Okay. How many of you have had a Gmail account for? I need to go back pretty far. At least 7 years. Might be pushing it there, right? It's been out for a while now. It seems like it really hasn't been, but it really's been out for a long time. In the early days, I remember when I entered into the pool to get the lottery for a Gmail account. And you could, like now it's like a convenience. You just jump onto the Gmail site and you request another account and you link them together. It takes 2 seconds, right? Back in the day, you were lucky when they finally sent you the invite to use Gmail.
Could you get it by someone inviting you who already had?
Not in the beginning. I'm talking Gmail day one. Yeah, once you got to, after the first 3 months that Gmail was doing their beta testing, then anybody can go on and get an account. But I'm talking, hi, we're Google and we just have email now. So, we want to have you come and help us test this. And I remember when you first got your account, I think they gave you 2 gigabytes of storage. The idea was you never have to delete an email. Because they wanted to attach Google searching. That's why Gmail's good, right? It's because you have Google searching within your email. That's the positive of it. In fact, if you're using Gmail outside of that, like for instance, I hardly ever log into Gmail. I use my iPhone email client to read it. I'm doing myself really a disservice in terms of searching email. I've taken away the feature that makes Gmail special. But in any case, I think day one they gave you 2 gigabytes of space. Back then, that was a lot of space. So, that was like the size of most people's hard drives. Actually, it might have been bigger than most people's hard drives. I'm trying to think of the year. This had to be 2002, 2003, something like that. But in any case, 2004? Okay, well, close. See, it's been a while. It's been a decade. Killing me. Anyways, and then what they would do is every single day you logged in, you'd see your storage space counting up. And you could even log in and watch it. And while you were sitting there using Gmail, your storage space would be going up like 1 megabyte at a time, like a counter, as Google was getting more and more and more and more storage. How much storage space do we have today in our Gmail accounts by default? 15 gigabytes. And then they have a little link and say, if you need more, just contact us. something like that, right? They might charge you for it now, I don't know, but they give you a lot of space by default. But in any case, hard drives are cheap. Memory is cheap by today's standards. It's no longer a problem. So modern day storage solutions use these storage area network ideas. And actually, most of our cloud storage computing is really an evolution beyond this generic term storage area network, where let's take Google's data store as an example. They have a warehouse filled with storage area network type devices, and they duplicate your data many times. So not only are they not trying to minimize the footprint, they're purposely multiplying the footprint. Why? So that when you need to request the data, you can get to your data quickly. You're not having to wait in line to access your data from the particular hard drive that it lives on, because it lives on a whole bunch of hard drives. Does that make sense? So the problem has really changed, this whole data storage thing. Same thing with computing. Computers are relatively inexpensive today. A long time ago, they were very expensive. So we tried to squeeze as much power as we could out of a single CPU, out of a single hard drive, out of a single memory chip. Where now, well, 2 is better than 1. 4 is better than 2. And just keep building it out. Reminds me of a quote from a movie. How many of you saw the movie Contact? Jodie Foster's it's a good movie, sci-fi. They get it's one of those. They're using the radio telescopes to listen to space, and they get some sort of alien signal, and they decode it, and they build the machine to take them to meet the aliens or whatever. It's a good flick, not like jokey flick. It's good. But there's an interesting quote in that movie dealing with, it was a jab at the United States, I guess. There was an international effort to build this machine that the aliens taught them how to build, I guess, through these specs they sent. And the original machine got blown up by terrorists. Well, the guy that was kind of the behind-the-scenes intermediary for Jodie Foster and those said, do you still want to go meet the aliens or whatever? Well, we can't. They destroyed the thing. It was no. There's the secret base. He showed this thing. Think like an American. Why build one when you could build 2 at twice the price? It's always funny. Okay, so our goals have changed, and this idea of clustered systems means more about computing power than efficiency from storage. Okay? All right, operating system structure, the concept of multiprogramming. This is the idea of having more than one program running at once, what we call multitasking. So a single user cannot keep CPU and I/O devices busy all the time. So we mentioned this. We said that our CPUs sit idle something like 95% of the time. Multiprogramming organizes jobs, so CPU always has one to execute. And when we say always, we're really saying sometimes. Because your CPU still sits idle most of the time. So the idea is that we want our operating system to try to make an effort to keep our CPU as busy as possible, as often as possible. A subset of the total jobs in the system is kept in memory. So whenever we have a program that we double click on, like Microsoft Word, it gets loaded into RAM. Why? Because RAM is fast, and RAM can send stuff into the CPU significantly more quickly than a hard drive can send stuff into the CPU. Okay, we have this idea of job scheduling, which I often refer to as CPU scheduling. It's the dude in charge of who gets to use the CPU now, CPU being a shared resource. Okay, when it has to wait, for example, I/O, we talked about interrupts. So if you have a program that's requesting some input-output from the user, well, that program's not going to sit there monopolizing the CPU. Instead, it's going to jump into the I/O queue, and another job's going to come in. Okay, so now we have this idea of time sharing. We've referred to this a little bit. The logical extension which CPU switches jobs so frequently that users can interact with each job while it's running, creating interactive computing. This is the idea of faking us out. It's moving between job and job and job and job so fast that we can't necessarily detect that we're not getting the full the full time of the CPU. Response time should be less than 1 second. This is from a user's perspective. So when we click, we want it to feel as fast as possible. I would maybe say this should be substantially less than 1 second. For those of you who are gamers, 1 second would be 1,000 millisecond ping. So if you're a gamer and you play first-person shooters and stuff, how many of you are first-person shooter players? Okay, would you even bother playing if you had a 1,000 millisecond ping? You'd just be dead, right? That means a 1 second delay between you giving it an instruction and that instruction actually happening. Typically, what are we looking for? A sub 100 millisecond ping? So a tenth of a second delay? The lower the better, right? In fact, I know historically, I assume they still do this at some level. Historically, in a game called Counter-Strike, which I think some people still play, right? You still play Counter-Strike? But I mean, that's an old game. Did they make updates to it still? Okay. I mean, I guess I'm thinking, see, I'm not into first-person shooters, so I'm thinking the original Counter-Strike, which was like popular like in 2000. So this is a game that's been around for like 14, 15 years. And it probably was out before that. That's when it was popular. Is back then. And I remember there was servers you would launch because people could run their own servers. And in fact, one of my students ran a server out of my office when I was at Western Illinois University. I didn't play on it because I suck at those games. But in any case, he ran that server out of there. And I guess it was a popular server. I don't know. But in any case, I know that he had it set up where if somebody didn't have a 75 millisecond or better ping, they would just get kicked off the server. Yeah, it was, they were kind of Nazis about it, I guess. So, interesting thing when it comes to response time. We can think about that in a whole bunch of different areas, not just CPU, not just user interaction from an operating system, but also when we start thinking about multiplayer games where you're using an internet connection. It's hard to get those things synced up because your internet connection becomes a reason why you might be a fraction of a second slower than somebody else, and that can mean a lot in those very high-paced games like first-person shooters. The different genres of games have different different thresholds for ping, right? So, for instance, I'm a MMO player, so I play World of Warcraft. Certainly, a 3,000 ping is not going to work, but generally speaking, a 300 or 400 or 500 millisecond ping probably is not the end of the world unless you're doing player versus player, which is going to be more like first-person shooters. But generally speaking, that would be acceptable for the game. So you can actually play WoW over a cellular hotspot for a period of time without having much problem. Those usually give you about 220 to 320 millisecond ping. But you wouldn't want to play a first-person shooter over a cellular hotspot. You would just lose. Okay. Although an interesting experiment for me would be with first-person shooters. I bet you that I would not live substantially less with even a 5,000 millisecond ping. I usually die really quickly. It's all a matter of how quickly they can find me. And since I get bumping into walls and stuff like that, they find me very quickly. That's right. Yeah, I'm that guy running into the corner because it's like too dark and I can't get turned around. I know, it's embarrassing. But it's weird because I'm like really good at WoW. Like not just capable of playing. I think I'm a very high-skilled World of Warcraft player. And completely incompetent in first-person shooters. It's just an embarrassment. Okay, each user has at least one program executing in memory. So we need to think about this. So time sharing can be applied to single-user operating systems, like Windows, like Mac OS. But it could also be applied to multi-user operating systems. Windows could be, but typically when we think about that, we're thinking about Unix type servers where you might have multiple people connected into this at one time. The best example for us to think about is like Google's web server, where you have some machine sitting there, or some cluster of machines sitting there, accepting requests from 1 million people per second, and each one of those requests becomes a little program that gets launched into memory and has to be dealt with. Okay? So that's where time sharing comes in. So each of those clustered computers has its own time sharing scheduling going on with its CPU. So if processes don't fit in memory, because we do have a finite amount of memory, even though we have lots of memory, we use something called swapping, where we use virtual memory on the hard drive, fake memory, to fit more crap in logical memory than we actually have physical memory. So that's virtual memory allows execution of processes not completely in memory at a cost of speed, but at least we can do it as opposed to having to turn away programs. Okay, not really an important slide here. I'm going to skip it. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting thing. So operating systems have something called user mode and kernel mode. So we kind of have different priorities set up for different processes. So the kernel or the operating system can run in kernel mode, where it's giving a preference to system level programs, or it can run in a user mode where it's giving a preference to user level programs. Now, each operating system might be set up slightly differently depending on the purpose of the operating system. So, for instance, Windows 8, the Mac OS, these guys are going to be user-focused operating systems. So when you double-click on Microsoft Word, you're getting a higher priority than, when we think about kernel-level, operating system-level programs, you have a whole bunch of them. Some of them are mission-critical. So those mission-critical ones are going to still be high priority. But then you have other ones like polling log files and, maybe the backup system. I think we've referenced that one other time. Things that are important, but not necessarily mission critical at an exact moment. We want our computer to auto backup when we're not using it, right? Let it go and do some of that crap, or virus scan. Sure, we want to always have virus scanning on our computer, and most of the new, the modern day virus stuff, what do? They check your email as it's coming in. They check your email as it's being sent out. They're trying to be proactive based on your actions. But in terms of just doing a global scan of your hard drive, just looking for viruses that you already have, if it finds one, we don't want those to be high priority, because that'll slow our computer way down, right? Why does it slow our computer down? Based on what we've learned in here, why would a full system virus scan slow our computer down from a user's perspective?
Because you would have to search the hard drive.
Mm-hmm.
The hard drive would be going back and forth between all different.
Yeah, so now we're competing. We're competing for access to the hard drive. In fact, something I said in here several classes ago when we were talking about building your own computers is one of the best places to spend your money from a perceived speed of your computer is going to be a higher speed hard drive. At least 7,200 RPMs. If you could afford it at 10,000 RPM, but then you got to start fighting with capacity versus speed. Typically going from a 7,200 RPM hard drive, well, with 7,200 RPMs, you can pretty much get the biggest capacity hard drives. You can get the 3 terabyte drive, no problem. So it's really a no-brainer to get a 7,200 over a 5,400 RPM hard drive. Now you get up to the 10,000, you'll notice there's a pretty big drop-off in capacity, very similar to the solid-state drives. You can get a solid-state drive today, but you're going to typically get far less capacity at a far higher price. Same thing is true with the 10,000 RPM hard drives. It'll be less expensive than solid-state, but more expensive than 7,200 RPM.
How is the speed of a solid state recorded?
It's not recorded in RPMs because there are no moving parts. So it has more to do with the organization of it. Solid state drives are basically flash memory. So it has more to do with the organization of the cells inside of it. I don't know the exact speed that some of these guys are measured at, but it becomes the challenge becomes the link between serial ATA, the connecting piece, and the way that you search the hard drive, and having to switch back between those two, convert between those two. But I would say your fastest solid state drives today are probably at least twice as fast as your fastest serial ATA mechanical hard drives. It's probably a reasonable assessment with far less heat given off because there's no moving parts, and reasonably speaking, a smaller failure rate due to definitely impact, because now you don't have the moving parts, so it's not going to be susceptible if you have a spinning hard drive and you drop your laptop. Modern laptops have some mechanisms in them to try to detect that I'm in a free fall. Let's lock the hard drive and hope for the best, as opposed to one that's just going to keep spinning. It's equivalent to, well, how many of you have used a record player?
Oh my god. Yeah.
It's equivalent to using a record player and having it on there and then dropping that. Chances are music's going to stop playing and your record's going to get scratched. At the very least, you're going to hear that sound as the needle goes slipping across the record. How many of you have never used a record player? Just out of curiosity.
Wait 5 years. 5, 10 years.
You think?
What's a record?
Well, even in here though, I mean, most of you were born 2000. So what, late mid 90s? So, let's take 94. I mean, I don't think people were using records in 94. I think 94 we were certainly on cassette tapes. When did CDs come out?
About that time.
Around there. So you were the
They were
you were the tail end of cassettes diving into CDs. I remember the 8-track.
8-track. You're horrible.
When I was a kid, our car had an 8-track player. My brother and I had Muppets music on 8-track. True story. What was I talking about? Oh, okay. So, user mode versus kernel mode. Just kind of a choice an operating system needs to make to determine who it's going to mostly benefit. Mode bit provided by hardware provides ability to distinguish when system is running user code or kernel code. Some instructions designated as privileged only executable in kernel mode. So that's kind of a protected mode. One thing you have with memory management systems is you typically have a portion of RAM that's completely protected from user programs. That's where the operating system actually lives. So typically when you have somebody writing a virus, a C program or something like that, that's trying to corrupt the operating system and memory, causing you to reboot, which would probably be the easiest virus out of all of them to write, rather than finding a weird hook to break into a program or something like that. You basically are just going to screw around with memory, causing them to have to reboot their computer. No permanent damage, but it's going to at least tick them off. So that would probably be the easiest virus to write in a language like C or C++. While this idea of protected memory is hopefully a means to bypass or at least protect against that, where somebody writing a C program can't, without some extra work, access memory that could cause the whole system to come down. Word crashes, typically that's not crashing your hard drive, right? The operating system itself starts having parts of it ripped out of memory or overwritten in memory. That's what's keeping your machine alive, if you will. Now you're going to have to reboot your computer so that the operating system freshly gets copied into memory. Becomes a problem.
That little thing you can write into someone's startup where it starts a loop and every 5 minutes or something it opens the CD tray.
I haven't seen that, but it seems like it's something that would happen. But then I would follow it up by saying, what's a CD tray? Computers don't come with them anymore, do they? I mean, we pretty much got rid of CD trays a while ago. Then we just had the front loading, right? No tray, you just put it in there. And now we just done away with digital media altogether. How many of you in here have a laptop that does not have a drive for a DVD? Most of us, especially if you bought a computer in the last couple of years. We just moved away from that, right? We're all these places are distributing software over the internet. Now, if you're going to install Microsoft Office, you don't run to Best Buy and buy the disk. What do? Go to Microsoft's website and you download Office. You install it. Or you go onto torrents and you download Office with the provided crack and you install it, which you don't have an excuse for anymore now that Microsoft gives it away to the university, right? See? So those who have a stolen copy of Office, you should get rid of it and get a legitimate copy for free. Okay.
Don't they sell OSs on running systems on disk a lot of times usually?
They do because it's simpler to reinstall, but a lot of the, for instance, I assume Windows has the same thing, but because I'm always installing Windows on a virtual machine, so I don't necessarily see this part of it. But like the Mac, if you have a Macintosh that's dead in the water, you can reboot it and hit, I think it's Option R or Command R, one of the two, and it goes into recovery mode, where it has a small partition on the hard drive that allows you to contact the App Store and re-download your operating system and install it without any media. So if Windows doesn't have the equivalent, they will soon. I would assume they have some sort of recovery mode that allows you to pull off something like that. Anybody you know? On the Windows side? This is what happens when everybody steals their operating system. Like, well, I just re-downloaded it. I have it burned to a DVD, and I got the crack. There's a folder on there to bypass the security key. Okay, transition from user to kernel mode. Timer to prevent infinite loops. Process hogging resources. Set interrupt after a specific period. Again, every operating system is going to have user and kernel mode support, but user-focused operating systems are going to give more preference to user side. Server class operating systems are typically going to give more support to kernel side because it needs to handle multiple requests coming in and it might need to do clustered systems. Okay, kind of a stupid slide, just skip it. We kind of get the point. Process management. This is another large, one of the large components of an operating system. As we start, we're getting pretty close to start talking about these in detail, each individual one. So we've talked about, process management. Again, it's kind of like CPU management. A process is a program in execution. It's a unit of work within the system. Program is a passive entity. Processes is an active entity. So when you have a program that's sitting on the hard drive and you double click on it and it gets loaded into memory, then it becomes a process. And processes are what vie for CPU time. So process termination requires reclamation, requires reclaim of any usable resource. Reclamation sounds more bestest there, doesn't it? All right, so when a program closes, we need to give up the memory that was associated with that program. And that's going to be the job of the memory manager. Make sense? Now, something we'll talk about is what does it mean to give up memory? Well, we don't need to erase the memory. We just need to mark it as not being used by somebody else so it can be overwritten. Memory is kind of like a whole bunch of hardware-based variables that don't have names, instead they have indexes. It's kind of like having a giant array where we just have to keep track of which buckets we've stored different stuff in related to our various programs. But the operating system itself, the memory manager, needs to be notified that a certain collection of buckets that were previously being used by a program that's being terminated are no longer being used, so it can mark it as available for other programs to pick up. A single-threaded process has one program counter specifying location of next instruction to execute. Process executes instructions sequentially, one at a time, until completion. Multi-threaded processes have one program counter per thread. And this becomes kind of interesting because, so we think about the program counter. If you have your high-level Java program and you compile it, now it's going to turn into a low-level program, which has a one-to-one relationship with the CPU, right? So we're just going to go down the line, perform this magic trick, then this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. That's the program counter. The guy that knows which is the next instruction that needs to get executed, okay? And sometimes when you have things like if statements that get implemented in the CPU with something called a jump, which we'll look at in the architecture class. We'll look at some assembly language stuff in there. But you might skip over 40 instructions here in the middle and get down to this one because this wasn't logic that was meant to happen. So that program counter keeps track of what needs to get executed next. In a multi-threaded process, which we talked about last time, each individual thread is going to have its own program counter. Now that doesn't mean that each individual thread acts as a different process. We talked about this last time. It means that whenever a thread is getting CPU time, it's going to pick up where it left off on its particular program counter. Does that make sense? So one program counter for a single threaded application, multiple program counters, one per thread for a multi-threaded application. But each of those program counters are independent of each other. They just keep track of where does this particular thread pick up when it next has CPU time. Typically, a system has many processes, some users, some operating system running concurrently on one or more CPUs. And last time we talked about the difference between threading and forking, of course, right, Abe? Abe was a big fan of forking. So anyways, in a process that spawns off child processes through the fork command, we are going to now have multiple single-threaded applications. That make sense? And in that case, each of those processes is going to have their own program counter, but those program counters are independent to that actual, quote, application running in memory. And they're getting their own share of CPU time. All right. Can we get through the slide set today? I'm going to have to rush. I want to get through the slide set and start dealing with real good stuff. Operating system is responsible for the following activities. Creating and deleting both user and system processes, suspending and resuming processes, providing mechanisms for process synchronization. What does this mean? It means, and this becomes, this idea of process synchronization came into existence when we started dealing with the idea of multiple processes, multiple threads, multiple CPUs, multiple processors, where we might have aspects of an application running concurrently or seemingly running concurrently. And what if one of those things is reliant on something else? We might need to synchronize two different threads or two different processes. In Java, we have a keyword called synchronized that allows us to have a method that's called thread safe. That's known to be thread safe. So if we have two separate processes that try to hit this one method, only one of them gets it at a time, and it actually treats that method as a shared resource, and people have to get in line for it. So it blocks other threads from using it while one thread is inside that process. So process synchronization can mean that. It could also mean that one process can't start up or can't complete until another process has notified it that it's completed. So when we talk about inter-process communication, there are various mechanisms for one process to let another process know about something, so they can keep tabs on each other and make wise decisions based on the problem they're trying to solve. So that these two kind of go hand in hand. This process communication, usually it's called inter-process communication. You may have seen it in a book somewhere as the acronym IPC, inter-process communication. Usually it's in all caps. Okay, deadlock handling. It's another mechanism operating systems have. That's when you have two processes. Well, an example of deadlock might be when you have two processes vying for the same resource and keep getting interrupted and keep going back, and they never actually get to finish the job they're trying to do. Probably where we see deadlock the most often in modern operating systems is swapping between virtual memory and real memory. Less common today because we keep just throwing more and more real memory into our computers, but one of the things that operating systems have to be able to handle is how do we recover from deadlock? You know, if you've ever sat in front of your computer and it seems like it's all frozen up and you see the little hard drive light just flashing, and nothing you can do, just hear make kind of your machine just sounds like it's working really, really hard, yet you can't do anything. It's just kind of stuck. chances are it's stuck with virtual memory, swapping in and out of memory. Because one of the things we're going to talk about is how do we decide what to remove from real memory to make room for something we need to bring in from virtual memory. What if we remove something that somebody else is going to need in a millionth of a second? Now you're going to bring it right back in. What if you swap out something that something else is going to need in a millionth of a second? That was fun to do. Okay, so what's up? Can you make an animated GIF? So in any case, that's something that we're going to have to talk about is how do we determine, or we could say determine, how do we guess which is the best thing to swap out when we don't have a name for it yet, but it's going to be a page. How do we determine which page to swap out of memory that is least likely to be needed soon? And if we pick poorly, then we start running into deadlock. Actually, the official name for swapping related deadlock is something called thrashing. Thrashing. What's up? Choose wisely? Which part?
Indiana Jones.
Oh, the cup.
Yeah.
That looks like a carpenter's chalice, right? Everybody in here has seen all the Indiana Jones movies, right? Oh, that doesn't surprise me about you. Hasn't there been like a whole bunch of movies that you should have seen you haven't seen?
Yeah. At least I'm not as bad as I'm.
Really? You've seen Indiana Jones, right?
I think.
Have you seen Star Wars?
Yes.
Have you seen Old School?
Uh-oh.
How many in here have not seen the movie Old School? I know you haven't. You're not even raising your hand. You haven't seen. You've seen Old School?
Yeah.
Since I assigned it to you?
I saw it before I met you.
Are you sure? Who am I thinking of? Is that you, Evan? Somebody that I've yelled at recently hasn't seen Old School. Show yourself. Have you seen Old School? Oh, you said you haven't. Well, I just found that out. You need to see Old School. There will be a quiz about Blue. Blue, you're my boy. Favorite scene is when they're on top of the school with the cinder blocks. How would that play out in the news today with, hazing? If you're on top of a building throwing cinder blocks off the building that have strings attached to one of your body parts.
Very stupid.
Hey, you really want to get into this fraternity?
There, no.
Oh, man.
Nobody needs to see that.
Plus the hazing where they showed up in like the creepy van and just like kidnapped them from like supermarkets and stuff. They're coming out with a sequel. You know that? They talked about the sequel the day that movie hit the theater, but they're actually, I think, officially coming out with a sequel now. Well, oh my God, Farrell and Vince Vaughn. Oh, it's gonna be great. Maybe they'll bring Blue back. Have to be in some.
Oh, he's dead.
Well, they'll have to do it in some sort of probably drug-induced vision or something. But I bet you he makes the movie. Actually, is the real actor dead? That could be problematic. Kind of like the Harry Potter movies where they expected us to not notice that Dumbledore changed.
Old School is not on Netflix, FYI. It's not on streaming Netflix.
Oh, you got to be able to watch it somewhere. Maybe Amazon Prime or torrents. Perfectly legal torrents of a movie you're supposed to pay for. Okay. Memory management as opposed to process management. All data in memory before and after processing, all instructions in memory in order to execute. So that's the job of a memory manager. It needs to make sure that instructions that the CPU needs to execute get loaded into memory first, whether it came directly from the hard drive when the program first loads, or the CPU needs a specific page of memory from an application that's currently stored in virtual memory. Memory management determines what is in memory when optimizing CPU utilization and computer responses to users. So this guy has to know at all times what's really in memory and what's really not in memory, whether it's in swap memory or this is a program that hasn't been loaded. Memory management activities keep track of which parts of memory are currently being used and by whom. So when a program terminates, like we talked about several slides ago, it has to make sure it marks those pieces of memory that it was occupying as now available. Deciding which processes or parts thereof and data to move into and out of memory. Allocating and deallocating memory space as needed. And where we've seen that before is with the new keyword in Java. The new keyword is our real estate agent, which talks to the Java virtual machine, which has a real estate agent, which talks to the memory manager, which gets us some real memory, which can then allocate to the virtual machine's memory, which will then give us a fake memory address. See, simple. Storage management. Operating system provides uniform logical view of information storage, abstracts physical properties to logical storage units, which we call a file. Each medium is controlled by a device. So we have a disk drive, a tape drive. Varying properties include access speed, capacity, data transfer rate, access methods, sequential or random. And we've seen this in practice. When you go onto your computer, you see your hard drive show up. If you put in a DVD, you see that show up as an I/O device. If you put in a USB drive, you see that show up as an I/O device. And from our perspective, those things aren't different from one another in terms of how the operating system presents them to us. But we know through experience that if we copy something to the hard drive, likely it's going to be quicker than if we're copying something to the flash drive, which is likely going to be quicker than if we're writing something to a DVD. So we know that under the hood, those things are being controlled by various hardware mechanisms, but from our perspective, they're all storage mediums. That make sense? So storage management tries to abstract that for us, even though it's, so from our perspective, we're always using I/O devices that show up differently through the icons. One looks like a DVD, one looks like a, depending on your operating system, a jump drive thing, or at least different than a hard drive might look. That kind of stuff.
I found it.
Which part?
The actor who played Blue died like 10 years ago.
Did he? Oh. Hey, maybe they'll just have the Dumbledore guy play him.
Yeah.
He looks just as much like Blue as he looked like the original Dumbledore. They would have been better off of having the dude from Lord of the Rings play. Yeah. He looked a lot closer to the original Dumbledore than the second guy did, didn't he? I mean, heck, I looked more like Dumbledore than that. It's terrible. Terrible. See, now he's going to get me sick. That sounded like a sick cough. Oh my gosh. This classroom's like a petri dish. All right, let's finish the slide real quick before we bail. File system management. Files usually organized into directories. We're used to that. Access control on most systems determine who can access what. You can put file permissions on it. Operating system activities include creating and deleting files and directories. We're all used to that. Primitives to manipulate files and directories. Mapping into files onto secondary storage. So if we were wanting to put something onto USB drive, that works as well. Backup files onto stable, non-volatile storage medium, which is actually less common today. We don't use tape backups very often. Now we just throw a second hard drive on and say copy crap, right? So one of the jobs of storage management is to provide that mechanism that we're all used to using of going in and working with files and folders. Make sense? All right, stop there. Come back on Wednesday. We're going to finish up this slide set and then get into actual specifics of each of these things.
When is our midterm?
Midterm will be, what week is this right now?
6?
It's week 6? It'll be, is it week 8? Something like that.
I just don't want to get blindsided.
Yeah. It'll be right before our the fall break. The week before fall break, or the week of fall break, whatever it is.
Yeah.